Tonight, we're heading back to medieval England. You know, that misty, damp stretch of history full of kings who couldn't stop fighting their cousins, queens who mostly died in childbirth, and peasants who worked the same muddy patch of land until their backs snapped. So, dim the lights. Settle in. Let's drift back, about 1,000 years, to a time before tea existed, which, frankly, was already a bad sign. Our story really begins after Rome packed up and left Britain in the early 400s. The Romans had been around for centuries, building roads, baths, and towns with proper plumbing. And then one day, they just left. No goodbye note, no we'll keep in touch, nothing. Britain suddenly found itself like a teenager whose parents went on permanent vacation. And almost immediately, the house got trashed. Without Roman order, everyone started raiding everyone. Germanic tribes, the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, showed up from across the sea and said, "Nice island, we'll take it." And just like that, Roman Britain morphed into Anglo-Saxon England. These early Anglo-Saxon kingdoms weren't exactly stable. You had names like Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, all competing to be the England before England existed. They spent centuries stabbing each other, raiding villages, and occasionally writing very short poems about how sad they were. It was basically Game of Thrones, but with more mud and fewer dragons. Just when the Anglo-Saxons thought they had things under control, the Vikings arrived around the late 700s. Imagine living your quiet farming life, and suddenly, a longship full of tall blonde men shows up to burn your church and steal your livestock. They hit monasteries first, which made sense, because monks were rich and unarmed. The first big raid was at Lindisfarne in 793, and it traumatized everyone so much that chroniclers literally thought the world was ending. The Vikings didn't just raid, they settled. They moved into northern and eastern England, calling it the Danelaw. They brought their own language, customs, and possibly better hygiene than the locals. One of the more famous Viking kings, Guthrum, even converted to Christianity, mostly because King Alfred the Great beat him and said, "You can stay if you get baptized." So Guthrum said, "Sure, fine," and got dunked in holy water. Problem solved. Now, Alfred of Wessex is worth a slow mention here. He's the only English monarch officially called the Great, and not without reason. He managed to unite most of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms under his rule, defend against Viking invasions, and start a legal system that kind of made sense. He was also the kind of man who'd decopy Latin books by candlelight, because he thought everyone should be literate, which, in the 9th century, was radical stuff. There's a famous story where he supposedly burned some cakes while hiding from Vikings. Apparently, a peasant woman told him to watch the bread on the fire, and he got so deep in thought about strategy that he let it burn. So yes, England's greatest king was also history's first distracted multitasker. After Alfred, the Wessex family line kept going. His descendants, Edward the Elder, Athelstan, and others, slowly pushed the Vikings out and formed something that finally looked like one kingdom. England. Athelstan in particular was impressive. He was Alfred's grandson, and in 937, he defeated a coalition of Scots, Irish, and Norse at the Battle of Brunanburh. Chroniclers wrote entire poems about how glorious it was, which is medieval code for, it was awful. Thousands died, and everyone smelled like iron and mud for weeks. But the victory mattered. For the first time, England was united, and as history tends to go, the moment someone united it, everything immediately fell apart again. By the late 10th century, the Vikings were back. This time, led by people like Sweyn Forkbard, yes, that was his real name, and his son Canute, or Canute, who eventually became King of England. Sweyn invaded because the English king at the time, Tellard, the Unready, paid him off to go away. Unfortunately, Sweyn realized, wait, this guy just gave me gold to leave. I could just not leave. Lelred's nickname, the Unready, didn't mean he was lazy. It came from the Old English unread, meaning bad counsel. Basically, everyone thought his decisions were terrible. He married a Norman princess, fled the country twice, and generally made England look like a kingdom on the verge of a nervous breakdown. When Canute took the throne in 1016, everyone just accepted it. They were tired. England was like, fine, we'll try being Danish for a bit. Canute turned out to be surprisingly competent. He ruled England, Denmark, and Norway at one point, the so-called North Sea Empire. He also had one of the most misunderstood PR moments in royal history. You've probably heard the story. Canute sat on the beach and commanded the tide to stop, to show his power. Except, he wasn't actually being arrogant, he was proving a point. He wanted to show his flatterers that even a king couldn't control nature, which, for a medieval monarch, was an unusually humble move. So yes, King Canute, ruler of 3 kingdoms, destroyer of egos, and apparently one of the only men in history to lose an argument to the ocean and still come out looking wise. After Canute's death, things got confusing again. His sons ruled briefly, then died, and England eventually went back to the old Wessex line, this time with Edward the Confessor. Edward was pious, gentle, and apparently allergic to making decisions. He spent most of his reign building Westminster Abbey, which is beautiful, but not particularly helpful when your nobles are constantly threatening civil war. He also didn't have children, which was a massive problem, because when a king doesn't have an heir, medieval politics turn into a family reunion hosted by a pack of wolves. When Edward died in 1066, 3 men claimed the throne: Harold Godwinson, his English brother-in-law; William, Duke of Normandy, his distant cousin; and Harold Hardrada, the King of Norway, who basically said, "I heard there's a throne going spare." This was not going to end peacefully. First, Harold Godwinson beat Hardrada at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, a brutal fight that ended with thousands dead, and the Norwegians limping home. Harold probably thought, "Great, I saved England." Then he got the news that William of Normandy had landed in the south. So he marched his tired army all the way back, and just a few weeks later, fought the Battle of Hastings. It didn't go well. Harold famously took an arrow to the eye, though historians aren't totally sure if that is true, and William won. The Normans were here, and from that point, England would never quite be the same. William was a tough, calculating man with a short temper and a big appetite for control. He'd been born a bastard, literally. His enemies called him William the Bastard, and he spent his entire life proving them wrong. After Hastings, he systematically replaced the Anglo-Saxon elite with his Norman followers. If you were English and owned land, you probably didn't by the end of his reign. He built castles everywhere, because nothing says I am in charge like a few hundred stone fortresses looming over the countryside. He also commissioned the Doomsday Book in 1086, basically a medieval census, recording who owned what, down to the last pig. Imagine the world's most obsessive tax audit, written on parchment, by monks who hated their jobs. For ordinary people, not much changed. Still farming, still poor, still muddy, but the language began to shift. The ruling class spoke Norman French, while peasants spoke Old English. This split eventually fused into the hybrid we now call Middle English, the awkward teenager phase of the English language. Feudalism also became official. Everyone owed loyalty to someone above them, all the way up to the king. So even if you were technically free, you still had to hand over part of your crop, your labor, and occasionally your children, to your lord. Basically, medieval England was a pyramid scheme, but with swords. William died in 1087 after a horse accident, and because medieval succession was never simple, his sons immediately fought over everything. He left Normandy to his eldest son, Robert Curthose, who had the world's least intimidating nickname, and England to his second son, William Rufus. Robert was lazy. William Rufus was reckless. Rufus spent most of his reign annoying the church and raising taxes. He also died mysteriously in a hunting accident in 1100, allegedly shot by one of his own men. Though accident feels like a generous term when everyone benefits from your death. His younger brother, Henry I, immediately seized the crown before Robert could react. Henry was efficient, shrewd, and not above bending the rules. He even issued a Charter of Liberties, an early attempt at limiting royal abuse, mostly to make himself look better than his brother. He ruled well, but fate had a dark sense of humor. In 1120, Henry's only legitimate son, William Adelin, was sailing across the English Channel on a fancy new ship called the White Ship. It was packed with nobles, wine, and poor decisions. The crew got drunk, the ship hit a rock, and nearly everyone drowned, except one man, a butcher from Rouen, who clung to a floating barrel. Henry's son was gone, and with him, the smooth succession he'd planned. When Henry died years later, there was no clear male heir. He had made his daughter, Matilda, his successor, but medieval nobles didn't love the idea of taking orders from a woman, and so began one of the ugliest family feuds in English history. From 1135 to 1153, England fell into civil war between Matilda and her cousin Stephen. Chroniclers later called it the Anarchy, which sounds dramatic, but really it was just endless sieges, burned villages, and general exhaustion. There's a famous line from a contemporary writer, "Christ and his saints slept," which is medieval for "everything went to hell." Matilda did manage to get her son, Henry, accepted as Stephen's heir. So when Stephen finally died, peace, or something like it, returned, and the new king was a young, fiery redhead named Henry II. So, when we last left off, England had just survived a decades-long family meltdown known as the Anarchy. Half the country was on fire, the church was exhausted, and everyone agreed it was time to maybe try something different. Enter Henry II, son of Empress Matilda and grandson of Henry I, at only 21 years old. He inherited not just England, but a huge chunk of France too, because apparently medieval geography was just a suggestion. Henry too wasn't exactly what you'd call chill. He was energetic to the point of mania. Chroniclers described him as short, stocky, constantly on the move, and unable to sit still for 5 minutes. His hair was supposedly bright red, which fits, because he spent most of his reign angry about something. But credit where it's due, he was smart, really smart. He rebuilt royal authority after years of chaos, reformed the courts, and basically invented the English common law system. So, if you've ever had to deal with a legal contract, you can thank or curse Henry II. He also believed in working himself to death. He'd travel on horseback from one end of his empire to the other, sleeping in tents, rarely stopping, and shouting orders to exhausted clerks trying to keep up. Imagine your most intense boss. Now give him an army and control of half of Western Europe. Then there was Eleanor of Aquitaine, his wife. If Henry was fire, Eleanor was steel, brilliant, sophisticated, and impossible to control. Before marrying Henry, she'd been Queen of France, but divorced King Louis VII because, as she allegedly put it, he was more monk than man. So she remarried to the fiery Duke of Normandy, who'd soon become King of England. A bold move, considering that within months, she went from French royalty to being Queen of France's biggest rival. Medieval gossip must have been wild that year. Together, they ruled an empire stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees. It looked impressive on a map, but politically, it was like trying to babysit 10 toddlers with swords. Henry and Eleanor had 8 children. Half of them became kings. All of them hated each other. Henry's favorite son was young Henry, the young king, who was crowned during his father's lifetime, a decision that, predictably, went wrong. Because, if there's one thing medieval monarchs were bad at, it was sharing power. The young king wanted real authority, not just a shiny crown and zero responsibilities. Henry II said no, so his sons revolted, more than once. In 1173, 3 of them, the young king, Richard and Geoffrey, teamed up with their mother, Eleanor, to overthrow their dad. Yes, Eleanor literally sided with her sons against her husband. It's the kind of family dynamic that makes succession look healthy. The rebellion failed, but the damage was done. Henry never trusted Eleanor again. He locked her up in various castles for over a decade, which, in fairness, was his go-to problem-solving strategy. While all that family drama was simmering, Henry managed to create an entirely new crisis with his best friend, Thomas Becket. Becket had been Henry's drinking buddy and chancellor, the guy who handled royal paperwork and probably laughed at his jokes. So when the position of Archbishop of Canterbury opened up, Henry thought, perfect, I'll make my friend Archbishop, and the church will finally listen to me. But the moment Becket put on the robes, he changed completely. He became pious, independent, and infuriatingly stubborn. Henry wanted control over church courts. Becket said no. It escalated into a full-blown feud. Becket fled to France, got exiled, came back, and kept defying the king. And then came 1170, the year Henry supposedly shouted something like, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" A few of his knights took it literally, rode to Canterbury, and murdered Becket inside the cathedral. They hacked him to death at the altar, right in front of horrified monks. It shocked everyone. Henry didn't order it directly, but the guilt haunted him. He did public penance, walking barefoot through Canterbury and letting monks whip him, which, if nothing else, really set the tone for future English kings and their bad decisions. By the 1180s, Henry's health was failing, and his sons were circling like vultures. The young king died of dysentery, while rebelling against poetic justice. if you like irony, and his younger brother Richard became the favorite. Richard had a flair for leadership and warfare. He also had zero patience for his father. In 1189, Richard joined forces with the King of France and rebelled one last time. Henry finally broke down, both physically and emotionally. When he died, he learned that even his beloved youngest son, John, had betrayed him too. His last words, supposedly, were, "Shame, shame on a conquered king." It was a pretty grim ending for a man who'd spent his whole life trying to control everything, only to be undone by his own family. Next came Richard I, better known as Richard the Lionheart. He's often remembered as the ultimate medieval hero, tall, brave, noble, the kind of guy Disney would turn into a talking lion. In reality, he barely spent any time in England. He spoke French, preferred castles in Aquitaine, and viewed England mostly as a bank account to fund his crusades. Almost his entire reign was spent abroad. He joined the Third Crusade to the Holy Land, where he clashed with the Muslim leader Saladin, who, by the way, was far more respected and competent than most of his European opponents. Richard won a few battles, but never took Jerusalem. Then, on his way home, he got captured in Austria by Duke Leopold, because apparently Richard insulted him by tearing down his banner. Medieval kings had the emotional maturity of high school students. England had to pay a massive ransom to get him back, about £100,000 of silver, which was roughly 2 to 3 times the kingdom's annual income. Every peasant, merchant, and noble got taxed to the bone. Richard finally returned home, stayed a few months, then went right back to France. He died there in 1199 after being shot with a crossbow during a minor siege. So yes, Lionheart, hero of legend, died over a petty land dispute in France. Poetic, in a disappointing way. Richard's brother, John, inherited the throne next, and it went downhill fast. John's nickname, Lachlan, said it all. He was the sibling who got nothing, and once he became king, he proved why. John was cunning but paranoid, greedy, and terrible at keeping allies. He lost Normandy and most of his French territories to King Philip II, got into endless fights with his barons, and even managed to get excommunicated by the Pope. It takes real talent to be hated by both your nobles and the church at the same time. In 1215, the barons finally snapped and forced him to sign the Magna Carta, a document that limited royal power and guaranteed certain rights. It's often hailed as the foundation of democracy, though at the time it was really just rich nobles saying, "Stop stealing our money." John agreed, then immediately broke his promises. This led to another civil war, more chaos, and eventually his death in 1216 from dysentery, while retreating through a swamp. England's kings had a real thing for tragic gastrointestinal endings. John's son, Henry III, became king as a child, which was never ideal in medieval politics. A regency council ruled for him until he came of age, and for a while, things looked stable. Henry loved art, architecture, and religion. He rebuilt Westminster Abbey in Grand Gothic style, which is still one of the most beautiful buildings in England. Unfortunately, he wasn't much of a politician. He spent too much money, favoured foreign advisors, and annoyed the barons again. This time, they were led by Simon de Montfort, Henry's brother-in-law, who eventually captured the king and ruled in his name. De Montfort even called a parliament in 1265, including not just nobles, but representatives from towns and shires. It was a small step toward modern democracy, though de Montfort himself died in battle soon after. Henry regained power and ruled peacefully until his death in 1272. After a century of chaos, England was finally ready for a king who could handle things. Mostly, Henry's son, Edward I, was tall, intimidating, and actually competent, a rare combo. He earned the nickname Longshanks because of his height and long legs, which apparently terrified people even before he spoke. Edward was the kind of king who liked order, preferably enforced with swords and stone walls. He conquered Wales, building a ring of massive castles like Caernarfon and Conway to keep the locals quiet. Then he turned his eyes to Scotland. He claimed overlordship, executed rebels like William Wallace, and earned the title Hammer of the Scots. It sounds impressive, but it mostly meant he spent years fighting in muddy fields for land he never fully controlled. Still, Edward laid the groundwork for a stronger, more centralized monarchy, and made sure everyone knew England was back to being a serious power. When he died in 1307, his son Edward II inherited the throne, and that was not good news. Edward II will take us into one of the weirdest, most dysfunctional reigns in English history, full of favourites, rebellions, and one very suspicious death involving a red-hot poker. When we last drifted off, England was under Edward I, the tall, commanding, castle-building king who conquered Wales, bullied Scotland, and terrified everyone around him. Now, imagine the opposite of that. That was his son, Edward II, a man who loved poetry, swimming, and hanging out with his favourite friends more than, say, governing. It's fair to say, the Plantagenet family didn't know what to do with him. Edward II came to the throne in 1307, and people had high hopes. His father had left him a strong kingdom, full coffers, and a reputation for discipline, and Edward promptly squandered all of it. He was handsome, tall like his father, and apparently quite charming when he wanted to be, but he was also impulsive and stubborn, which combined with his fondness for luxury and favourites made him deeply unpopular. And then there was Piers Gaveston. Piers was a Gascon noble, witty, flamboyant, and dangerously charismatic. Edward adored him. They spent all their time together, hunted together, threw lavish parties, and gave each other expensive gifts. Naturally, the English barons hated him. They thought Piers had too much influence, and worse, that Edward gave him royal lands and titles that should have gone to serious men of state. Now, historians have debated their relationship for centuries. Were they lovers? Maybe. Close friends? Definitely. Either way, Edward's obsession with him overshadowed everything else. At one point, when Parliament demanded Gaveston's exile, Edward literally cried and begged them to let him stay. That was not how medieval kings usually behaved. The barons eventually forced Gaveston out, and then killed him in 1312. Edward was devastated. He never really recovered emotionally, and his hatred for the nobles only deepened. To make things worse, Edward inherited his father's unfinished war with Scotland. In 1314, he led an enormous army north to crush Robert the Bruce, who had been slowly reclaiming Scottish territory. It did not go well. At Bannockburn, the English army found itself trapped in marshy ground, surrounded by determined Scots with pikes. Edward panicked. His army was crushed. It was one of the most humiliating defeats in English history. Thousands died. Robert the Bruce became a Scottish legend, and Edward II returned home to a chorus of nobles whispering that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't cut out for this whole king thing. Now, Edward's wife, Isabella of France, deserves her own slow introduction. She was the daughter of Philip IV of France, one of Europe's most formidable kings. Smart, politically savvy, and patient. Too patient maybe. At first, she tolerated Edward's favourites. But when Gaveston was replaced by new companions like Hugh Despenser the Younger, who was somehow even worse, she'd had enough. The Despensers were greedy, cruel, and openly power-hungry. They seized land, exiled rivals, and basically turned England into their personal playground. Edward, once again, did nothing. By 1325, Isabella had had enough of watching her husband destroy the kingdom. So she went to France under the pretense of diplomacy, and just didn't come back. In France, Isabella met Roger Mortimer, an exiled English nobleman who had rebelled against Edward and escaped prison. The two quickly became allies, and, according to most chroniclers, lovers. Together, they raised an army, landed in England in 1326, and declared that they were rescuing the realm from Edward's tyranny. Most nobles immediately joined them. Even the church sided with Isabella. Edward and the Despensers fled, but they were captured. The elder Despenser was executed in a particularly gruesome way. Medieval justice didn't do subtlety, and Edward himself was deposed in 1327. Edward II was imprisoned in a series of castles. Officially, he abdicated in favor of his 14-year-old son, Edward III. Unofficially, everyone knew he wasn't long for this world. And here's where the story gets dark and weirdly legendary. A few months after his deposition, Edward II was reported dead. The chroniclers claimed he was murdered in a horrifying way, a red-hot poker inserted. Well, you can imagine. The idea was that it left no outward mark, preserving his royal body. Modern historians doubt it actually happened. It was probably propaganda, meant to humiliate him in death as much as in life. More likely, he was quietly smothered. Either way, the result was the same. Edward II was gone, and England had a new teenage king, with his formidable mother and her lover running the show behind him. Edward III technically became king in 1327, But in reality, Isabella and Mortimer ruled. They lived lavishly, handed out titles to themselves, and quickly became as unpopular as Edward II had ever been. It turns out, overthrowing a tyrant doesn't automatically make you better at ruling. By 1330, young Edward had grown tired of being a puppet. At only 17, he staged a quiet coup at Nottingham Castle, sneaking in through a secret passage with his friends, arresting Mortimer, and taking control. Mortimer was executed for treason. Isabella was spared, but placed under comfortable house arrest for the rest of her life. And just like that, England had a real king again, one who actually wanted to rule, and rule brilliantly. If Edward II was a disaster, Edward III was a renaissance. He restored royal authority, rebuilt England's pride, and with typical Plantagenet flair, started a war that would last over a century. But in fairness, it began with a family squabble that got out of hand. Edward's mother was French, which gave him a theoretical claim to the French throne. When the French King Charles IV died without a male heir, Edward said, "Technically, I'm next in line." The French nobles said, "Technically, you're English." They gave the crown to Philip VI instead. Edward didn't take that well. In 1337, he declared himself King of France and launched what became the 100 Years' War. It would drag on for generations, long after Edward was gone. But it started here, with one very confident young king and a strong sense of entitlement. Edward III turned war into pageantry. He founded the Order of the Garter, promoted knights as heroic symbols, and made battle seem almost romantic if you ignored the starvation, disease, and burning villages. His eldest son, Edward of Woodstock, became known as the Black Prince, not because of anything sinister, probably because of his black armor. The Black Prince was everything a medieval propaganda writer could dream of: handsome, brave, ruthless, and talented in battle. He won a stunning victory at Crécy in 1346, where English longbowmen destroyed the much larger French army. Later, he captured the French King John II at Poitiers in 1356, which was both a triumph and a public relations masterpiece. Back home, Edward III's court was the closest thing medieval England ever had to a golden age. Architecture, art, and poetry flourished, trade expanded, and the crown's authority was stronger than it had been in a century. Everything was perfect, until, of course, the plague arrived. In 1348, a mysterious disease swept through England, the Black Death. It killed anywhere from a third to half of the population. Whole villages vanished. No one understood what was happening. Some blamed bad air, others thought it was divine punishment. Doctors wore strange beaked masks filled with herbs, which did absolutely nothing. Even the royal family wasn't spared. Edward's daughter Joan died of the plague while traveling to marry a Spanish prince. The shock rippled through the court. Economically, though, the plague changed everything. So many peasants died that labor became valuable for the first time. Wages rose. Feudalism began to crack, and the medieval world started shifting toward something new, something that looked a little more like modern England. Edward III ruled for 50 years, long enough to see his golden age dim. His beloved wife, Philippa of Hainault, died. His once brilliant sons quarreled, and in his later years, he fell under the influence of corrupt courtiers. The Black Prince died before him, leaving a child, Richard, who would become king after Edward's death in 1377. By then, the old king was frail, forgotten, and barely conscious. He died quietly in his bed, a rare peaceful ending for a Plantagenet. He'd ruled longer, fought harder, and left England more powerful than it had been in centuries. And yet, what he left behind, ambition, pride, and endless royal rivalry, would tear his descendants apart. When Edward III died in 1377, England mourned. The old king had ruled for half a century, long enough for people to forget what life was like without him. But history doesn't stop for grief. His grandson, Richard II, only 10 years old, suddenly found himself King of England. He was young, he was beautiful, he was intelligent, and, as time would prove, he was absolutely not ready for the job. At first, Richard's uncles and advisors ran the show. The most powerful among them was John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, a man so rich and confident that he sometimes seemed more like a rival than a guardian. The kingdom Richard inherited was uneasy. The long wars with France had drained the treasury. The Black Death had gutted the workforce, and people were tired of paying for wars that brought them nothing but taxes. The spark came in 1381. It started small, just a tax collector in Essex, demanding payment from peasants who'd had enough. But by summer, England was on fire. Imagine thousands of ordinary villagers marching on London, carrying farm tools and makeshift weapons, chanting that all men should be free. That was the Peasants' Revolt, one of the most shocking uprisings in medieval Europe. It was led, in spirit at least, by a man named Wat Tyler, and inspired by the fiery preaching of John Ball, who asked a simple, dangerous question: when Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? In other words, if God made everyone equal, why are some men lords and others serfs? The rebels burned tax records, stormed manors, and beheaded officials. They even broke into the Tower of London, the most secure fortress in England, and executed the Archbishop of Canterbury on the spot. It was chaos. And then, the strangest thing happened. The 14-year-old king rode out to meet them. On June 14, 1381, Richard rode to Mile End to confront tens of thousands of rebels. He was calm, polite, and shockingly brave for someone barely old enough to shave. He told them he would grant their demands: freedom, fair rents, and an end to serfdom. The crowd cheered. For a moment, it looked like England might actually change. But the next day, at Smithfield, things turned deadly. Wat Tyler met with the king again, and was suddenly struck down by the mayor of London. The rebels panicked. Then, Richard did something extraordinary. He rode forward alone and shouted, "I am your king. Follow me." Astonishingly, they did. The revolt collapsed within days. Richard had saved his own crown for now. After the revolt, Richard was hailed as a hero. But something in him changed. He had looked into the face of chaos and realized how fragile kingship really was. Over the next decade, he became increasingly obsessed with authority, with control, with obedience, and with the idea that the king was not merely a ruler, but a divinely chosen being. He dressed in gold, surrounded himself with flatterers, and demanded that people kneel and address him as Your Majesty, a new term for English kings. His court became a glittering, expensive spectacle, full of art, poetry, and pride. But behind the silks and candles, resentment simmered. Richard's extravagance and favoritism drove the nobles mad. Led by his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, John of Gaunt's son, and other powerful lords, a group calling themselves the Lords Appellant rose up against him in 1387. They accused Richard's friends and advisers of corruption, and one, the so-called merciless Parliament, executed or exiled most of the king's favorites. For a few years, Richard lived quietly, pretending to accept his reduced power. But he never forgot, and he never forgave. By the mid-1390s, Richard was in his late 20s, elegant, clever, and still haunted by betrayal. One by one, he eliminated his enemies. He exiled Henry Bolingbroke. He seized estates. He ruled through fear and ceremony, like a man convinced he was born above all others. Chroniclers said he believed himself almost divine, that to question him was to question God's will. And in medieval England, that kind of thinking was dangerous. When his uncle John of Gaunt died in 1399, Richard confiscated his lands, instead of letting them pass to Henry Bolingbroke. It was a fatal mistake. While Richard was away campaigning in Ireland, Bolingbroke returned to England, officially, just to reclaim his inheritance. But everyone knew it was more than that. Nobles who hated Richard flocked to his banner. Castles opened their gates without a fight. Even the people cheered for Henry the calm, practical alternative to their increasingly paranoid king. Richard landed in Wales, found almost no support, and surrendered without a single battle. For the second time in 50 years, England watched one king overthrow another. Richard was imprisoned in Pontefract Castle, where he faded from public view. In September 1399, Parliament declared him deposed, and Henry Bolingbroke became Henry IV, the first king of the House of Lancaster. Richard died soon after, officially of starvation, though probably not by choice. His body was displayed in London to prove he was really gone. But for years afterward, rumours persisted that he was still alive, hidden in Scotland or Wales, waiting to return. Even in death, he was an enigma, a dreamer born in the wrong century. Too proud for politics, too fragile for the throne. Henry IV's coronation marked a turning point. For the first time since 1066, a king had taken the crown, not by inheritance, but by force. It set a dangerous precedent, one that would echo through English history for generations. Henry had won the throne, but he would soon learn that keeping it was another matter entirely. because rebellion, illness, and betrayal were waiting just around the corner. Next time, we'll slip into the troubled reign of Henry IV, his brilliant son Henry V, and the fading spark of English power in France. The age of heroes, poets, and endless war. But for now, the torches in the great halls are burning low, the bells toll softly over the dark rivers of England, and the young, tragic face of Richard II disappears into the long, unbroken sleep of medieval history. When Henry Bolingbroke took the throne in 1399 as Henry IV, England got what it thought it wanted: a steady hand, a practical ruler, a man who seemed more solid than the silk-draped dreamer he replaced. But of course, nothing in medieval England ever stayed peaceful for long, especially not when the crown was taken, not inherited. Henry IV was no tyrant, but he wasn't exactly popular either. He came to power by overthrowing a cousin, and that kind of thing tends to make people nervous. To some, he was a usurper; to others, a savior; to everyone else, just another man trying to survive the mess his ancestors left behind. Almost immediately, rebellion brewed. The Welsh rose up under Owain Glyndwr, who declared himself the true Prince of Wales. The northern lords rebelled. Even the powerful Percy family, yes, the same one that gave us Shakespeare's Hotspur, turned against him. It was like Henry spent half his reign putting out fires that never stopped spreading. Henry also suffered from a mysterious illness that left him weak and scarred. Chroniclers described his skin blistering, his face burning red, maybe leprosy, maybe psoriasis, maybe stress, or maybe divine karma, depending on who you asked. By the early 1400s, the once confident warrior had become a worn, suspicious man clinging to power, while the nobility circled like hawks. He wanted stability. Instead, he got constant war, endless debt, and the quiet disappointment of a son who didn't seem to care. That son was Henry of Monmouth, better known as Prince Hal. If his father was grim and pious, Hal was the opposite: charming, reckless, and allergic to responsibility. He spent more time drinking in taverns than sitting in council meetings, and people whispered that he'd never make a decent king. Even Shakespeare couldn't resist turning his story into drama, a young prince wasting his potential in alehouses with shady friends like Sir John Falstaff, before suddenly transforming into a perfect monarch. It's poetic, of course, but even the real Hal had a flair for the theatrical. He could fight, charm, and command loyalty like few others. And under that playful exterior, there was steel. By 1413, Henry IV was sick beyond recovery. He died at Westminster, still haunted by the guilt of usurpation and the rebellions that followed him to the grave. Prince Hal, now Henry V, stepped up, and almost overnight, everything changed. The wild prince became the ideal king, disciplined, devout, and terrifyingly effective. Even his critics were impressed. England hadn't seen a ruler like him in generations. Henry V believed he had a divine mission: to unite his kingdom and reclaim the old Plantagenet claims to France, because apparently the 100 Years' War wasn't long enough already. In 1415, he launched his first campaign across the Channel, and it did not start well. Sieges dragged on, disease hit the troops, and supplies ran low. But then came Agincourt, October 25th, a muddy field in northern France. The English army, exhausted, hungry, and outnumbered 5-1, stood facing the cream of French nobility. It should have been a massacre. Instead, it was a miracle. Henry's archers, those deadly longbowmen, turned the battlefield into a slaughterhouse. The mud trapped the French knights, their armor weighing them down like anchors. Arrows rained down, horses screamed, and one by one, the flower of French chivalry sank into the filth. When it was over, thousands of French lay dead. The English had lost maybe a few hundred, and Henry V walked away with a legend. Even today, historians can't help but admire the cold brilliance of it. Though, to be fair, it probably helped that the French never agreed on who was actually in charge. Henry didn't stop there. He kept pressing his claim until France was practically on its knees. By 1420, he forced the Treaty of Troyes, a deal so outrageous it still sounds like fan fiction. Under the treaty, Henry would marry Catherine of Valois, daughter of the French King Charles VI, who was, inconveniently, insane most of the time. Their son would inherit both crowns, England and France. For a moment, it looked like Henry had pulled off the impossible. He was 33, a hero across Europe, and the embodiment of everything a medieval king wanted to be. So naturally, he died almost immediately. In 1422, Henry V fell ill, dysentery, probably while besieging a small French town he didn't even need. He died at Vincennes, never seeing his baby son. The child, Henry VI, was only 9 months old when he became king of 2 countries. England wept, but quietly. They'd had their golden king, their warrior hero. Now they had an infant, and the chaos that followed would make every previous disaster look tame. Henry's widow, Catherine, was left alone at just 20 years old. She was French, foreign, and politically inconvenient. So the English council told her not to marry again unless she got permission, which of course meant she married anyway. Her new husband was Owen Tudor, a Welsh courtier. Their secret marriage produced children who would eventually give rise to the Tudor dynasty, though no one could have guessed it then. But that's getting ahead of ourselves. For now, the baby Henry VI sat on the throne, drooling on royal documents and surrounded by scheming uncles. A perfect recipe for disaster. By the mid-1420s, England controlled half of France, but had no idea what to do with it. Taxes climbed, loyalties shifted, and everyone waited for the young king to grow up and fix things. Spoiler, he didn't. Henry VI would become one of the most tragic, timid, and ineffective rulers England ever had. His reign would drag the country into civil war, tear apart noble families, and drown the kingdom in blood, all while he quietly prayed for peace. When Henry V died in 1422, England gained a crown but lost a spine. The baby Henry VI, technically king of both England and France, was too young to rule either, and medieval politics had no patience for babies. For a while, the kingdom ran itself, or rather, it tore itself apart quietly, like an old cloak coming unstitched. Behind the nursery walls, powerful uncles and nobles began circling, each convinced they could guide the young king. Translation: rule in his place. Henry's 2 main guardians were Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, and Cardinal Beaufort, who loathed each other. Humphrey fancied himself the dashing defender of English honour. Beaufort, a churchman and Henry IV's half-brother, was more of a schemer with a holy title. Their rivalry set the tone for the next few decades: endless quarrels, petty power plays, and all the usual aristocratic nonsense that happens when the king can tell anyone to shut up. By the time Henry turned 18, England's hold on France was slipping. The once proud English empire was crumbling, and everyone knew it, except Henry. He was gentle, pious, and completely unfit for medieval politics. Think of him as a monk trapped in a king's body. While England bickered, France found new strength under Charles VII, helped along by a certain French teenager who claimed to hear voices. Joan of Arc. Her sudden arrival turned the tide. By the mid-1430s, the English were losing ground fast. Paris was gone. Normandy began to slip away. And yet, Henry's court seemed oddly calm, as if pretending France wasn't on fire might make it go away. In 1445, in a desperate attempt at peace, Henry married Margaret of Anjou, a French noblewoman with sharp wit and even sharper ambition. She was 17, he was 23, and their marriage would be the slow-motion explosion that finally broke medieval England apart. Margaret wasn't content to play the quiet queen. She was fierce, political, and used to getting her way. Unfortunately, she had to work with a husband who'd rather pray than govern. Henry was kind, but hopelessly passive, the kind of man who'd see a rebellion and suggest sending a polite letter instead of an army. So Margaret filled the vacuum. She backed the ambitious Duke of Suffolk, whose peace deals with France outraged the English public. When Suffolk was murdered by angry sailors and tossed overboard in 1450, Margaret became the obvious scapegoat. Whispers began. The Queen was French, untrustworthy, maybe even plotting to replace English advisors with her own allies. They weren't entirely wrong. In 1453, Henry received terrible news. England had lost Bordeaux, its last major foothold in France. The empire his father built was gone. That same year, Henry suffered a complete mental collapse. He stopped speaking, stopped recognizing people, and sat blankly in silence for over a year. Doctors called it melancholy. Modern historians suspect catatonic schizophrenia or severe depression. Either way, England suddenly had no functioning monarch, and into that vacuum stepped Richard, Duke of York, the man who claimed he should have been king in the first place. Richard of York had royal blood through both his parents. He was ambitious, capable, and not subtle about thinking he'd do a better job than Henry. When Henry fell ill, Richard became protector of the realm. He ruled efficiently, calmly, and most importantly, not as a puppet of the Queen. Margaret hated him instantly. When Henry miraculously recovered in 1455, Margaret pushed York out of power. Within weeks, England was divided into two camps: the House of Lancaster, symbolized by a red rose, supporting Henry and Margaret; the House of York, symbolized by a white rose, supporting Richard. Thus began one of the most exhaustingly petty civil wars in European history, the Wars of the Roses. It started small, as these things do. Both sides gathered troops for protection, and then, predictably, decided to test those troops on each other. At St. Albans, the Yorkists struck first. It was a massive battle, maybe a few hundred casualties, but it set the tone. The Lancastrians were beaten, and Richard of York suddenly had the king in his custody. Henry, naturally, forgave everyone. Margaret, naturally, did not. Margaret spent the next few years rebuilding the Lancastrian cause. She raised armies, forged alliances, and made it her mission to destroy York, not just politically, but personally. By 1460, the two sides were trading victories and losses like a grim chess match. York briefly seized control again, even had Parliament declare him heir to the throne, effectively disinheriting Henry's son, Prince Edward. That, unsurprisingly, didn't go over well. Margaret's forces met York's army at Wakefield that same year. The result was a bloodbath. York was killed in battle. His head was stuck on the gates of York City, wearing a paper crown. Margaret had made her point. Unfortunately for her, Richard's eldest son, Edward of York, turned out to be annoyingly competent. Tall, handsome, charismatic, basically the medieval version of a movie star with a sword. Edward picked up his father's cause and charged straight for London. In 1461, he met the Lancastrian army at Towton, fought one of the bloodiest battles ever on English soil, and won. Tens of thousands died in snow and mud. And when it was over, Edward rode into London as Edward IV, the first Yorkist king of England. Margaret and Henry fled north, then to Scotland. For a while, England had peace again, or at least something resembling it. Edward IV was everything Henry VI wasn't. He was decisive, bold, and loved the good things in life: wine, feasts, women, and expensive clothes. He built alliances, stabilized trade, and made the monarchy look glamorous again. But because this is England, of course, it couldn't last. Edward's biggest mistake was marrying for love a widow named Elizabeth Woodville, whose large, ambitious family immediately began climbing the royal ladder. His closest ally, Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, known as the Kingmaker, felt betrayed. He switched sides, because apparently, betrayal was the national pastime. Warwick teamed up with, wait for it, Queen Margaret and the exiled Henry VI together. They briefly overthrew Edward in 1470, restored the confused, passive Henry to the throne, and celebrated what they called the readeption. It lasted less than a year. Edward returned, crushed Warwick at Barnet, and then defeated Margaret's forces at Tewkesbury in 1471. Her teenage son, Prince Edward, was killed in the aftermath. Henry VI was quietly murdered in the Tower of London soon after, almost certainly on Edward's orders. With that, the Red Rose of Lancaster was effectively dead. Edward IV ruled for another 12 years. He rebuilt London, strengthened trade, and actually made England look stable again, which, by this point, was almost suspicious. But old ghosts never stayed buried for long, because when Edward died suddenly in 1483, his sons were still children, and the man left to protect them was his loyal younger brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. You can probably guess where this is going. So, the Wars of the Roses are finally over. England has spent 3 decades flipping coins over who gets to sit on a fancy wooden chair. Out of the chaos steps a man named Henry Tudor, who claims the throne mostly by default. He's the last guy standing. That's right, Henry VII, the man who somehow convinced England he had a legitimate claim after winning at Bosworth in 1485. He wasn't particularly charming or handsome. He looked like he was perpetually suspicious of everyone, and to be fair, he was. After watching nobles backstab each other for 30 years, Henry VII basically turned paranoia into policy. His motto might as well have been trust no one, tax everyone. He rebuilt the kingdom's finances with ruthless efficiency. He created a government that operated like a medieval IRS with swords. If a noble had more money than he liked, Henry found a way to find them. If someone looked at him wrong, he charged them for disloyal facial expressions. Okay, not literally, but close. By the time he died in 1509, England was financially stable again, and about as fun as a tax audit. But then came his son, the one, the only, the headline hog himself, Henry VIII. Let's be honest, when people say Tudor England, what they really mean is Henry VIII and his trail of romantic disasters. The man had 6 wives, and about 6 million regrets. When Henry first took the throne, he was young, athletic, and charming, the Renaissance golden boy. Everyone thought he'd usher in a new age of brilliance and peace. Instead, he ushered in a personal soap opera so dramatic that even Netflix would struggle to condense it. His first wife was Catherine of Aragon, daughter of the Spanish monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella. They were married for over 20 years, and for most of that time, Henry was actually loyal. But Catherine failed to give him a surviving male heir, and that was all Henry cared about. So naturally, he decided that God was punishing him for marrying his brother's widow. The only solution: annul the marriage and start over. There was just one small problem: the Pope said no. So Henry did what any reasonable monarch would do when denied a divorce. He invented his own church. The Church of England was born not out of theological passion, but because one man really wanted to remarry. Enter Anne Boleyn, wife number 2. Smart, ambitious, and deeply unwilling to just be a side piece. Anne pushed Henry to take full control of the English church, which he did in 1534. That's the year England officially broke away from Rome, a political earthquake disguised as a love affair. Of course, Anne didn't end well. After failing to produce a son and being accused of everything from witchcraft to adultery, none of which had solid proof, she lost her head, literally. Henry then moved on to Jane Seymour, who finally gave him a son, the frail little Edward VI. Sadly, Jane died shortly after childbirth, and Henry spent the rest of his life pretending she'd been his one true love. Romantic, right? His next wives were a blur of bad decisions. Anne of Cleves was chosen based on a flattering portrait, but when Henry met her in person, he famously declared she looked like a Flanders mare. The marriage was quickly annulled. Catherine Howard, much younger and far less cautious, was executed for adultery, which, in Henry's mind, was apparently the greatest sin a woman could commit, despite his own track record. Finally came Catherine Parr, who managed to outlive him, mostly by being clever enough to keep her mouth shut and her head attached. By the end of his reign, Henry had transformed England forever. He'd split from the Catholic Church, centralized royal power, and spent a fortune on palaces and wives. The man died, obese, ulcer-ridden, and half mad, but undeniably, he left behind a kingdom more powerful and independent than he found it. When he finally passed in 1547, his only surviving son, Edward VI, took the throne. Poor kid, he was 9 years old, sickly, and surrounded by ambitious men who saw him as a puppet. His reign lasted just 6 years before he died, likely of tuberculosis. Next came Mary I, Henry's daughter with Catherine of Aragon. She's better known by her nickname, Bloody Mary, and it's not just because of the cocktail. Mary was a devout Catholic, and she was determined to undo everything her father had done. She restored papal authority and ordered the execution of hundreds of Protestants. The fires of Smithfield became a grim symbol of her reign. It's easy to see why history hasn't been kind to her. She married Philip II of Spain, hoping to strengthen her Catholic cause, but the union was unpopular and childless. By the time she died in 1558, England was exhausted, religiously divided, politically shaky, and ready for a different kind of ruler. That's when Elizabeth I stepped in, and suddenly England had something it hadn't seen in a while: stability, but not the quiet kind. Elizabeth's reign would become one of the most iconic in English history. Let's drift into that next. The age of spies, sea dogs, and suspiciously pale makeup. When Elizabeth I took the throne in 1558, England was in rough shape. The country had been swinging between Catholic and Protestant like a confused pendulum. The treasury was running low, and there were about a dozen European monarchs who thought they could bully this island nation into submission. Elizabeth, however, had other plans. She was 25 years old, clever, stubborn, and already well aware that people underestimated her. After all, she was a woman in a man's world, a world that still believed a crown belonged on a head with a beard. But Elizabeth had something better than a beard. She had brains, patience, and a gift for turning politics into theatre. From the beginning, she made one thing clear: she would rule in her own way. She wasn't going to be her sister, burning people at the stake, and she wasn't going to be her father, chopping off heads when dinner got awkward. Instead, she created a new kind of monarchy, one built on image, performance, and careful manipulation. Elizabeth's first move was to settle the whole religion issue once and for all, or at least make it confusing enough that everyone could live with it. The Elizabethan religious settlement of 1559 basically said, "We're Protestant, but not aggressively Protestant." The services looked Catholic, the theology leaned Protestant, and everyone was told to just smile and nod. It was genius. Of course, her cousin Mary, Queen of Scots, wasn't smiling. Mary had her own claim to the English throne and a talent for making bad decisions. She fled Scotland after a messy reign and sought Elizabeth's protection. Big mistake. Elizabeth, ever cautious, kept her under comfortable house arrest for nearly 20 years. It was like a royal Airbnb, minus the freedom. But Mary couldn't help herself. She got tangled up in plots, actual, letter-in-a-box, treason-level plots, to overthrow Elizabeth. Eventually, even Elizabeth couldn't ignore it. After years of hesitation, she signed Mary's death warrant in 1587. The execution was a political nightmare, but it sent a clear message: don't mess with the Virgin Queen. Now, speaking of virgin, let's talk about her infamous unmarried status. Elizabeth never married, and she milked that fact for all it was worth. She played every European prince like a lute, promising just enough affection to keep alliances alive, but never enough to lose her independence. It wasn't romantic, it was strategy. Her closest companion was Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, a handsome court favourite whose wife conveniently died under mysterious circumstances. People whispered, of course, but Elizabeth never gave anyone proof of anything. Whether she truly loved Dudley or simply enjoyed the attention, she never crossed that final line. Her body was single, but her throne was married to England. Meanwhile, the Elizabethan court was a strange mix of brilliance and paranoia. Poets, playwrights, and scientists flourished: Shakespeare, Marlowe, Francis Bacon, all thriving under her golden aura. Yet behind the glamour, spies were everywhere. Sir Francis Walsingham, her spy master, ran an early version of MI6. Letters were intercepted, coded messages decoded, and traitors caught before they could blink. Elizabeth's England was as much a stage as it was a fortress. And then came the Spanish Armada in 1588. Spain's not-so-subtle attempt to invade and depose her. Philip II of Spain, her former brother-in-law, sent a massive fleet of ships, convinced that God and good weather were on his side. Spoiler, they weren't. The English navy, smaller but more agile, harassed the Armada through the Channel, setting fireships loose and scattering the formation. Then nature stepped in. Storms battered the Spanish fleet all the way up the North Sea and around Scotland. By the time they limped home, half the fleet was gone. Elizabeth, dressed in white armour at Tilbury, declared to her troops, "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king." It was pure theatre, and it worked. She became a legend. After that victory, Elizabeth's image as the Virgin Queen became national mythology. Her portraits were filled with symbols: pearls for purity, suns for glory, hands on globes for dominance. She wasn't just a ruler, she was an idea. Of course, time still catches up with ideas. In her later years, Elizabeth grew more isolated. Many of her old friends and advisors died, including Dudley. The younger generation saw her as a relic. She struggled to name an heir, haunted by the same fear every monarch had. What happens when I'm gone? She died in 1603, after 45 years on the throne. A reign that turned England from a shaky, divided kingdom into a confident, unified power. The Elizabethan age would forever be remembered as a golden era, even if it wasn't quite as shiny as the legend suggests. And when she finally passed, the crown went to James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England, uniting the two crowns for the first time. Let's float gently into that next chapter, where witch hunts, paranoia, and Shakespeare's patron meet a new kind of royal awkwardness. When James VI of Scotland became James I of England in 1603, it was like England and Scotland entered a royal long-distance relationship. Technically united, emotionally complicated, and full of cultural misunderstandings. James arrived in London, convinced that he'd been chosen by God to rule both kingdoms. which, in fairness, was a very stupid thing to believe. He was the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, the same Mary Elizabeth I had executed. So, awkward family reunion there. Still, James was smart, scholarly, and full of confidence, maybe a bit too full. He believed kings ruled by divine right, meaning he answered only to God. Parliament, in his view, was more of a suggestion than a partner. James fancied himself a thinker and a peacemaker. He even wrote books. The True Law of Free Monarchies, a thrilling read, if you enjoy being lectured by a king and demonology, a treatise on witchcraft that helped justify witch hunts across Britain. Yes, the same man who translated the King James Bible also believed in witch hunting. The 1600s were full of contradictions like that. At first, James tried to ease tensions between Catholics and Protestants. He promised tolerance, but tolerance was a dangerous word in early modern England. Many Catholics still saw him as their ticket to freedom. When it became clear he wasn't about to restore their rights, a few decided to take matters and barrels of gunpowder into their own hands. Enter the Gunpowder Plot of 1605. A group of conspirators, including the now infamous Guy Fawkes, planned to blow up Parliament during its opening session, killing the king and much of the government in one fiery statement. The plan was elaborate, but, like most grand conspiracies, someone couldn't keep quiet. An anonymous letter tipped off the authorities, who discovered Fawkes guarding the explosives in the cellar beneath Parliament. He was tortured, confessed, and executed, along with his conspirators. The failed plot made James look like a divinely protected monarch, which only reinforced his ego. November 5th became a national holiday, known today as Bonfire Night, where people celebrate by burning effigies of Fawkes, because nothing says unity like annual arson. Despite the drama, James's reign wasn't all bad. He encouraged exploration, supported literature, and presided over what historians call the Jacobean Age, the tail end of the English Renaissance. This was Shakespeare's later period, when plays like Macbeth and King Lear were written, both of which flatter and insult kings in equal measure. Still, James's obsession with divine monarchy and spending habits annoyed Parliament. He loved fancy clothes, masks, and elaborate court entertainments, all while the treasury struggled. England's finances, once rebuilt under the Tudors, were sliding back toward crisis. When James died in 1625, his son Charles I took over, and everything that had been simmering under the surface came to a boil. Charles was quiet, dignified, and incredibly stubborn, the kind of person who would rather ruin a kingdom than admit he was wrong. He believed, even more than his father, that kings were chosen by God. Unfortunately, Parliament disagreed. From the start, Charles was in trouble. He married Henrietta Maria of France, a Catholic princess, which made his Protestant subjects nervous. He then began ruling without Parliament entirely, collecting taxes through dubious fees and fines. He dissolved Parliament multiple times, eventually deciding he didn't need it at all. For 11 years, he ruled solo, an era now called the personal rule. But absolute monarchy doesn't pay for itself. When Charles needed money to fund wars against the Scots and Irish, he had to crawl back to Parliament in 1640. By then, his critics were furious. What followed was one of the most disastrous breakdowns in royal relations in English history, the English Civil War. It wasn't an instant explosion. It started slow, like a pot about to boil over. On one side, the royalists, or cavaliers, loyal to the king. On the other, the parliamentarians or roundheads, led by men like Oliver Cromwell, a zealous Puritan who believed God was definitely not on Charles's side. The war dragged on for nearly a decade, filled with sieges, betrayals, and muddy fields. The royalists lost battle after battle, and by 1649, Charles was captured, tried for treason, and sentenced to death. His trial was short, his fate certain. On a cold January morning, he walked to the scaffold outside the banqueting house in London and calmly laid his head on the block. One swift stroke, and the age of divine monarchy was over. For the first and only time in its history, England became a republic. Cromwell took control, calling it the Commonwealth, though it looked suspiciously like a dictatorship. He banned theatre, closed inns, outlawed Christmas celebrations. Basically, he outlawed fun. His Puritan regime ruled with strict moral codes and endless sermons. It turns out, a joyless theocracy doesn't make for great tourism. When Cromwell died in 1658, the system collapsed almost instantly. The army didn't want his son in charge, Parliament was sick of military rule, and the people were nostalgic for crowns and pageantry. In 1660, the monarchy was restored under Charles II, son of the executed king. The public cheered, hoping for a return to normalcy and maybe a good party. They were about to get both. Let's float there now, to candlelit banquets, plagues, fires, and a king who treated politics like an after-dinner hobby. When Charles II returned to England in 1660, the country collectively exhaled for the first time in 20 years. No more Puritan sermons, no more banned Christmases, no more being arrested for enjoying a pint. The monarchy was back, and so was fun. Charles, who had spent years in exile on the continent, had learned a few things from his father's mistakes. Mainly, don't argue with Parliament about everything, and always look like you're having a good time. He was tall, charming, quick-witted, and perpetually surrounded by laughter, music, and mistresses. England, starved for entertainment, adored him. The Restoration period was exactly what it sounds like, a reset button. Theatres reopened, playwrights returned, London's nightlife came back with a vengeance. And Charles, ever the showman, set the tone. His court was filled with poets, philosophers, courtiers, and scandal. The old Puritan values were replaced by something much looser, sometimes too loose. His nickname, the Merry Monarch, wasn't an exaggeration. He had at least a dozen acknowledged children with various mistresses, Nell Gwynn, the witty actress, being the most famous, but not a single legitimate heir with his wife, Catherine of Braganza. She was Portuguese, devoutly Catholic, and quietly miserable about the situation, but she endured it with royal grace. Charles wasn't all play, though. He had to rebuild a country still scarred from civil war. He worked to balance power between crown and parliament, enough charm to keep them happy, enough cunning to stay in charge. But his reign wasn't without disasters, and they came fast. In 1665, London was hit by the Great Plague, the last major outbreak of bubonic plague in England. It killed roughly a quarter of the city's population. The streets were filled with the sound of carts carrying the dead, and doors were marked with red crosses. Charles fled to the countryside, as royals often did during crises, leaving officials to manage the chaos. Just as London began to recover, the following year brought the Great Fire of 1666. It started in a bakery on Pudding Lane and tore through the city for 4 days, destroying over 13,000 houses. Amazingly, only a handful of people were recorded dead, though recorded is doing some heavy lifting there. The fire, devastating as it was, cleared out the plague-ridden slums and gave architect Christopher Wren the chance to rebuild London into the grand stone city we recognize today. Out of ashes rose St. Paul's Cathedral, one of England's most iconic landmarks. Through all of this, Charles somehow managed to stay popular. Maybe it was his humor, maybe it was the public's exhaustion with gloom. He could joke his way through crisis and still make people believe everything would be fine. But behind the charm, there was always tension, especially with religion and succession. Charles secretly leaned Catholic, but England was still firmly Protestant. His brother and heir, James, Duke of York, was openly Catholic, and that made Parliament nervous. Anti-Catholic sentiment was so strong that when a man named Titus Oates fabricated a story about a popish plot to assassinate the king, people actually believed him. Innocent Catholics were executed based on rumors. England had traded Puritan repression for paranoia. Charles played it cool. He maneuvered carefully, dodging Parliament's attempts to exclude his brother from the line of succession. His approach was simple: don't die and don't provoke. It worked for a while. By the time he died in 1685, he'd re-established the monarchy, stabilized the economy, and left behind a country that was both exhausted and addicted to drama. On his deathbed, he converted fully to Catholicism, because of course he did. It was his final twist. His brother James II took over next, and everyone immediately realized they had a problem. James wasn't charming, funny, or flexible. He was rigid, serious, and deeply committed to Catholicism. That might have been fine in another time or place, but in Protestant England it was political suicide. He quickly alienated Parliament by appointing Catholics to powerful positions and trying to bypass long-standing laws. The birth of his Catholic son in 1688 was the last straw. Protestant nobles, fearing a Catholic dynasty, invited William of Orange, a Dutch Protestant married to James's daughter Mary, to invade. James fled to France without much of a fight, an event politely labeled the Glorious Revolution. Glorious because it was relatively bloodless, and revolution because it completely changed how England was governed. William and Mary became joint monarchs in 1689, but under strict conditions. They signed the Bill of Rights, which permanently limited royal power and established Parliament as the real seat of authority. No more divine right, no more absolute rule. England had finally found its balance, a constitutional monarchy. It only took about 1,000 years, several beheadings, and one exploding parliament to get there. As the Stuarts faded into the background, the modern age began to take shape, one of colonies, commerce, and clockwork order. But before the world turned industrial, England had one more round of royal misadventures waiting. Let's drift onward into powdered wigs, Handel music, and a monarchy learning how to behave. When William and Mary took the throne in 1689, England officially became what we'd now call a constitutional monarchy. In other words, the king or queen could still wear a crown, wave at people, and look majestic. But Parliament was the one really running the show. It was the royal version of being promoted to ceremonial manager. Mary died young in 1694, and William ruled alone until 1702. He wasn't exactly the life of the party, serious, asthmatic, and constantly at war with France. But he stabilized the government and helped set the stage for something much bigger, the birth of Great Britain itself. In 1707, the Act of Union merged England and Scotland into a single kingdom under one flag and one parliament. It was a political marriage arranged for money, trade, and mutual convenience. Neither side was exactly thrilled, but the partnership lasted. When William died childless, the crown passed to Anne, Mary's sister. Anne was kind-hearted, but plagued by ill health and personal tragedy. 17 pregnancies, and not one surviving child. By the time she died in 1714, the Stuart line had run out of heirs, and England faced the same old question: who gets the throne now? Enter the Hanoverians, a German dynasty with a very distant claim. The nearest Protestant relative was George, Elector of Hanover, a man who barely spoke English and had zero interest in pageantry. Still, rules were rules. He became George I, and the Georgian era began. George I wasn't exactly a people's king. He spent most of his time speaking German to his advisors and ignoring the British public. He didn't even attend his wife's funeral because he de-locked her up years earlier for having an affair. Charming. With a disengaged monarch, power naturally shifted to Parliament and, for the first time, to a Prime Minister, Robert Walpole, often called the first to hold the title in a modern sense. He basically ran the country while George pretended to. It was an arrangement that worked surprisingly well, especially since George preferred hunting and German sausages to governing. Then came George II, his equally German son, who spoke a bit more English but was just as prickly. He fought with his ministers, his generals, and most famously, his own son. The Georgian court was basically a never-ending family argument conducted in 2 languages. Still, under George II, Britain began to expand its empire. Trade grew, cities like London and Bristol flourished, and the country's wealthy elite developed an obsession with refinement. This was the age of reason, when coffee houses replaced taverns, as intellectual hangouts and powdered wigs became mandatory for anyone who wanted to look important. Art, architecture, and music flourished. Handel's compositions filled royal halls. Hogarth's satirical paintings mocked society's hypocrisy, and Bath became the fashionable place to take the waters and gossip. But all that elegance had a dark side. Britain's wealth was built on the Atlantic slave trade and colonial exploitation. Sugar, tea, and tobacco, the comforts of polite society, came from brutal systems abroad. Few people at home cared to question it. When George III came to the throne in 1760, he wanted to be different. He was born in Britain, spoke English as his first language, and actually seemed to care. His motto was, "I glory in the name of Britain," which made people feel good about having a king who at least knew where he lived. Unfortunately, George inherited a growing empire and an even bigger headache: the American colonies. The British government, deep in debt after wars in Europe, started taxing the colonies to make up the difference. You might remember this part: no taxation without representation. The colonies didn't like it. Protests turned to conflict, and soon enough, the American Revolution was underway. George III was a tyrant in the cartoonish sense, more stubborn and out of touch than evil. But the loss of America in 1783 shattered his pride. For a king who believed in order and obedience, rebellion across the ocean was a personal betrayal. Then came his mental decline. Modern historians suggest it may have been a hereditary blood disorder, porphyria, but at the time, everyone just thought he'd gone mad. There are stories of him talking for hours without pause, foaming at the mouth, and shaking hands with trees, which, to be fair, were probably more polite than some of his ministers. His son, the Prince of Wales, took over as Prince Regent in 1811, ushering in what became known as the Regency era, the elegant, gossip-filled period of Jane Austen novels, lavish balls, and fashion so ridiculous it could collapse under its own embroidery. When George III finally died in 1820, he'd lived through revolutions, wars, and the transformation of Britain into a global power. His reign had been long, tragic, and oddly human. He was followed by George IV, the ultimate playboy king, whose main achievements were spending money and getting fatter. He built Brighton Pavilion, a seaside palace that looked like an Indian temple designed by someone who'd never been to India. His reign was decadent, but shallow, a gilded hangover from his father's era. After him came William IV, the Sailor King, a bluff, straightforward man who ruled briefly before handing the stage to his young niece, a girl who would reign longer than anyone before her and reshape Britain into something entirely new. Let's quietly move forward now, to gas lamps, railways, mourning veils, and an empire on which the sun never set.